Please allow me to introduce Asma Abu Muzaid, who is a gender and economic justice expert whose particular interest and expertise is around issues of gender, economic development, and climate change in Palestine. She has over 10 years of experience with her focus on gendered economic policies, women's rights in economic sectors, unpaid care, and domestic work campaigning, inclusive markets, and feminist economics in fragile and conflict areas. Her principal area of work has, of course, been Gaza and also the West Bank, but she's had a range of international experience working with international NGOs and is currently the Al-Shabaka Gaza Visiting Fellow, and has recently contributed to a book, Light in Gaza, Writing Born of Fire, which was published in 2020, and I believe she'll speak a little bit about that later, and a link will be provided later. So I think with no more ado, I'm going to invite Asma to speak on Palestinian identity and agriculture with Gaza as a case study. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you for everyone who's attending. I know that there is a global heat wave that is happening, and like where people are joining, particularly in places where there is a chronic electricity crisis. Thank you for taking the time and joining this conversation. We do talk about agriculture, but like agriculture and environment and climate change are very connected. So like as we dig into this conversation, I really appreciate taking the time and joining us today. I want to start with, so I come from a Bedouin community. Like my family are Bedouin families, and like understanding of how Bedouin community live, having a constant travel and moving is something that really shapes their identity. So historically, my family are Bedouin, and historically they settled in different places and they move. So that constant kind of movement was something that I always thought about when I think about my Bedouin heritage and Bedouin identity. But then for me, my grandmother, who is an amazing figure, God rest her soul, she would always tell me something that I never understood until I started working in the agriculture sector. She would always tell me that, you know, a lab covered with soil is much better than a lab covered with gold. And that's something she used to tell me when I was like 10 years old. And for me, it's like gold is like bling bling. So like she must have had things wrong. Like, you know, my grandmother did not get it well. Like she didn't see the glamorous, bling of the gold. That's why she's talking about the land. But as I grew up and like started working on issues of women economic justice in the agriculture sector and really looking at economic development in agriculture sector in Gaza, I started understanding more and more of what did she mean when she was talking about, you know, appreciating land to the point that the land means everything compared to the very generous monetized value of the land. And that has made me think so much about like what does it mean to be so much attached to the land, particularly for us as Palestinian. And to be honest, like when I saw the opportunity to contribute to a book about Gaza, I was like, okay, this is something I can, you know, contribute to. This is something we can talk about. And I did have a lot of conversation with my friend, because at the beginning, I thought that, you know, to talk about agriculture in Gaza beyond the sphere of, you know, developmental organization and how they discuss agriculture was not something that, you know, is normal to do. And like will it matter if we talked about agriculture? And I had a discussion with a very dear friend of mine. His name is Jihad, and we were discussing, like, is it important to talk about agriculture? People think about Gaza and they think about restriction on movement of people, and they think about the constant aggression that is happening. So, like, talking about poems and agriculture, to what extent this is relevant? And then we realized that there isn't much people who speak about agriculture, but not from the very technical, depoliticized view of developmental actor, but rather than agriculture as part of our identity. And in that journey of exploring what does agriculture mean to Palestinian as part of their Palestinian identity, was a journey, to be honest, that I undertook for like couple of years, and it got disrupted by the 2021 May aggression on Gaza. But it was something that I felt strongly about. Coming from where I am, living in a village in Gaza called Zawaida for so long. It's no longer a village right now, but like, looking at all of that, and like coming from a family that identify as Bedouin, yet all their practices is agricultural practices. All their practices, my uncles are farmers. So how does one navigate their Palestinian identity considering that? And that's why I started looking at the Palestinian identity and agriculture. And there is a lot of research that talks about how a person, form a connection to a place where they grew up in, how they form an attachment to the land where, they had memories and so on. But for farmers in general, that kind of attachment and connection, it goes beyond the emotional attachment, goes beyond the economic attachment, and it actually goes into like spiritual attachment, where people like they view land as not in a transactional way where you plant something, you get like the fruits and the crops and you sell it and that's it. Historically, farmers, and particularly Palestinian farmers, to them, land really meant life. And how it meant life, it's in the manifestation of every little detail. So like the Palestinian choices of having many kids so that they can cater for the land, the Palestinian attachment to the agricultural symbol as a way of talking about Palestine without talking about Palestine, was also related to how their agricultural identity was shaping their Palestinian identity. And the challenge of what we are seeing and what I've noticed is that when we think about Palestinian farmers right now, the image that we receive is a picture of a Palestinian farmer who is surviving, who is fighting poverty, who is a picture of misery, of hopelessness, helplessness. And that kind of picture is the one that is being sent out to younger generation in our Palestinian community and to future generation, that Palestinian farmers never had the agency, never had the technical ability, never had even the ability to define their own self and the ability to define their own identity. So what I've done is that really, is this the image of Palestinian farmers that I grew up with? Is this the image of Palestinian farmers where the Palestinian I know, the friends and family grew up with? And that's why I tried to look at how Palestinian farmers were, practicing agriculture over the course of 100 years. And to me, it was shocking what we've seen, like the Palestinian farmer that I read about and we have seen acting 100 years back. They were freedom fighters, they were political mobilizers, they were social agents. Those images and those roles that were played by the Palestinian farmers, particularly in the early of the 1930s, were images that kind of like collapsed over the years. And the collapse of these roles that was played by the Palestinian farmers did not happen in vacuum. It was a result of systematic colonial practices that was implemented by the Israeli regime. And how that kind of relationship with the land, because of these practices, has been disrupted, has been re-engineered, was something that we will discuss today together. I think what's important to compare, why does a Palestinian farmer who was a social actor, who was a political mobilizer, a freedom fighter, is now being portrayed as a helpless, hopeless person, it cannot be understood without understanding what were the main historical events that has shaped and systemic colonial practices that has shaped the Palestinian relationships with the land. And I want to focus on like some of the few myths that we hear, we grow up with, that exist all in the media when it comes to to Palestine and the capacities and the abilities of Palestinians. We all grow up with the myth that Palestine was a desert, that without the Zionist agricultural practices, this desert would have never bloomed. However, looking at historical records of the British consulate and the American consulate that used to exist in Palestine, and people who used to do a lot of journaling about Palestine in the 1930s and even like in 1800, shows a different pictures. It shows a blooming agriculture sector that used to plant olives. Olives historically has been one of the Palestinian product that Palestinians used to export to the pharaohs 2,000 years ago. Palestinians used to produce grape, citrus, cotton, so many different agricultural crops that used to be exported to Italy, such as wheat. And the British consulate report has mentioned how the Palestinian wheat used to in Italy to produce pasta, but also sesame that used to be exported to France, and Gaza, which is what used to be like Gaza right now, that the Gaza we know right now is only 1/4 of Qada Gaza that used to be in historical Palestine. The Qada Gaza used to produce a high quality barley product that used to be exported to the British and to the UK and Ireland to produce different Palestinian products. So the idea is that Palestinians lack the capacity and the ability to plant, to preserve the land, was something that was instantly and systematically being instilled through like a media propaganda to justify the Zionist project in Palestine. And just, I want to give an example of how advanced agriculture in Palestine was. Java used to export more than 1.6 million orange cases by 1913. And that shows the expanse of Palestinian produce at that time. Another example is Betir village in the West Bank, and how the Betir village structure in itself is considered a very historical agricultural example from the Canaanite time on which you can do advanced agricultural. And that's why it was considered one of the sites to be protected by UNESCO. So what we see is that historically, the Palestinian relationship with the land through agriculture was a very advanced relationship that does not only manifest economically, but also socially, and in what we can describe as a subsistence economy, because Palestinians at that time used to plant crops and yields that is very essential to their everyday life need, that is very essential for even like trade within the villages that used to exist together. And export was only something that is an extra to covering the needs of the Palestinian population. So we have this image of, a flourishing Palestinian agricultural sector. And I think it's important not to romanticize even that era of the Palestinian agricultural sector, because at that time we had like the British colonialism into Palestine, and farmers were struggling. So farmers were not rich. Farmers were not like having, the best life of the best time of their lives, but they were struggling because of the taxation that was imposed by the British imperialism. But at the same time, there was this fabric that existed among farmers and the social fabric that exists and constituted an integral part of the Palestinian life. As I mentioned, that kind of fabric went through so much structural changes that affect how Palestinians are viewing agriculture, how Palestinians view their own identity within agriculture. And one of the first attempts that happened to undermine the Palestinian agriculture is really the imposition of like high taxes by the British imperialism. And those taxes were in favor of the Zionist project and resulted in the confiscation of so much land because of farmers' inability to pay these taxes that at the early of the 20th century, 30% of Palestinian farmers become landless. So not only they lost their source of income and livelihood, they lost the land that was fundamental in keeping social relationship together. They've also lost the land that connected them with the national struggle for Palestine. So these are some of the things that was the early stages of how there was a disruption to the Palestinian relationship with the land. Now, the Palestinian farmers were not passive during this era. On the contrary, they actually utilized several tactics into fighting like inequality within the capitalist system at that time. They utilized protesting. They utilized even like issues like the 1936 national revolution, and they refused to pay taxes. All of these are tactics to rebel against the injustices that were against them. And the example of the 1936 revolution is an example of how Palestinians were extremely active in political mobilization. The 1936 revolution that lasted for 3 years until 1939 was actually sustained because the Palestinian rulers, rural community and the villages were the ones that were providing home, shelter, food, and even supplies to the revolution that refused the Zionist project, but also refused the British cruelty against imperialism against Palestinians. Now, the other significant event that affected and influenced Palestinian relationship with the land was the 1948 Nakba and the mass expulsion of Palestinians. The mass expulsion happened mainly in rural areas where agriculture was the main source of income. Not only that, what accompanied the Nakba and the expulsion and the ethnic cleansing of people was an environmental Nakba where a lot of the Palestinian flora and fauna has been destroyed and replaced with European trees like the pine trees. So what we've seen also with the environmental Nakba is the destruction of 1 million Palestinian, 1 million dunam of cereal that was reduced to only 17,000 dunam remaining. So it's not about the Nakba as a historical event did not only resulted in the mass expulsion of Palestinians and refugees, but also it resulted in an environmental Nakba. Now, what happened during the Nakba is that a person who used to own a land, who had this very strong relationship and connection with the land, and the land was a source of an inspiration toward political mobilization, toward being a social agent, suddenly lost all that land, all that source of income, and people were, re-engineered in a way to stay in a camps, to depend on aid, to wait for like humanitarian assistance for the everyday survival. And suddenly those Palestinians who used to be productive in the community are being told that they are refugees, that they do not know how to produce, they cannot produce because of the structural re-engineering that happened to them. Now, the Nakba in itself, particularly the environmental Nakba, was not a one-time event that was happening. On the contrary, it was something continuous, and we are seeing it now in even the Israeli practices toward Palestinian lands in the West Bank. For example, in 2015, the Israeli regime confiscated about 500,000 dunam in Area C in West Bank to be considered natural reserves. So like the whole of preserving environment narrative is being used as an excuse to take over Palestinian land, to even disrupt the relationship that Palestinians have with the land. And these so-called natural reserves are used for military training, are used for the expansion of illegal settlement. Now, going back to Gaza, unfortunately, there wasn't much research and study that looks at Gaza and the relationship of the Palestinian who became refugees in Gaza and how their relationship with the land has evolved. So a lot of the narrative or a lot of the information was really through something that is transferred through generation to another. So like one thing that I've noticed is that Palestinian refugees through storytelling to their children, to their grandchildren, were retelling the story of the land, and they were retelling the story of villages and how important the land was to them, and how it was something that was a reality. And then because of Nakba, it became the dream to go back home. It was the dream to go back and like cultivate citrus tree and go back and cultivate like so many of the crops that they use to do. And therefore, as part of their adaptation within the boundaries of what is known currently as the Gaza Strip, the main like aim of Palestinian refugees was to own a land, but then to establish a home. It's kind of like not to let go of the idea of the homeland before 1948, but rather than, having a home where I can create a replica of the village that we used to establish back home, in order to constantly remind ourselves that once we had a land, once agriculture was part of who we are. Now, among the other actors that, or events, historical events that affected Palestine, particularly in Gaza, and when you speak about agriculture in Gaza, people would always mention the 1960s, which is like, the period of time where people were planting citrus. It was considered the golden age in Gaza agricultural history in the past 100 years. And in people's memory, they think about citrus and they think about the power agriculture provided them because they used to export citrus globally, and because they used to plant citrus and become a brand that is related to Gaza, that is related to like how we are productive again. So it's kind of like reliving the pre-Nakba era in terms of being productive. But if we dig deeper into the golden age of agriculture in Gaza in the 60s and the 70s, we can clearly see the problem of classism, where people who become Palestinian refugees in Gaza became only agricultural workers who were not able to have all their rights, who their wages and daily labor was very exploitative in a way, in a sense. And then we have the elite traders who benefited the most in terms of agriculture. I just want to bring another practice that was very important in shaping the Palestinian agricultural identity, is that the Israeli policies was how can we make agriculture economically not feasible, so that people no longer have this strong relationship with the land. And in the period of the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, there was a lot of introduction of what we call colonial agricultural practices. So, for example, the introduction of cut flowers into Gaza agriculture, which is a luxury product. It's not basic products, and it benefits a specific category of farmers. So it does not provide food security to the population in Gaza, and the same goes with the strawberry. So the Israeli regime has introduced crops that is considered luxury crops, cash crops, and it's very linked to the export market. So the total control over these crops lies in the Israeli regime's hand. And we have seen how in the strawberry example, particularly, the moment the Israeli regime were able to produce economically feasible and environmentally friendly strawberry and export it to the European market, a lot of movement restriction happened to the Palestinian strawberry farming. So these are some of the significant events that went and shaped the Palestinian relationship with agriculture. Now, in the past 20 years, the constant destruction of agricultural infrastructure through the different Israeli aggression on Gaza had made a lot of the agricultural projects economically unfeasible, in a way that even younger generation of people whose parents are farmers no longer want to engage in agriculture. They want to depart agriculture, and we are seeing a lot of international aid pouring to bring young people back into agriculture, but that's also not progressing in a way that is feasible, and that has resulted in a break in the social contract that Palestinians historically have had with the land, where it's easier to sell the land and to have a lab filled with gold than a lab filled with soil. And without looking at this, to be honest, when I was looking at that, and when I was looking at the Palestinian identity, I really wanted to romanticize it, because with romanticization comes hope, that there is a hope for us to continue, and there is a hope for us to look at agriculture as something that is fundamentally part of our identity. But the reality is that we are really losing it. The positive side is that there are attempts currently in Palestine that tries to retrieve that relationship with the land through historically examining and documenting that relationship. These efforts are very, very advanced in the West Bank compared to the Gaza Strip. We still have a very, very long way to go in terms of natural reserves in the Gaza Strip, in terms of even educating young generation on how we did have a relationship with the land, how agricultural practices and farming used to be a political act against the occupation, against injustices in general, not only the occupation, against capitalism, and how we are losing this and how can we retrieve it again. I'll stop here, Carol, and we can discuss any of the questions in the discussion.
Thank you very much for that overview, and also sharing because I would very much encourage people who are joining us to read, if they have a chance, to read your chapter, which gives an overview of how you feel in the last 100 years people have changed, and the contemporary, the historical challenges to do with colonialism in the earlier period, but also sort of in the second half of the 20th century and now, how things have been changing. One of the first sort of, after reading your article and speaking with you before, as sort of a lot of the trends that you pick up on, as we commented, they're global trends. They don't only affect the context of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the sort of, if you like, idealization of agriculture, but also people are moving away from it in the current environment, and the effects of globally, the effects of capitalism, and so that agriculture has become something very, very different today, that is much more transactional and about the price of the food. We have to feed the Middle East. Grain is moving from Ukraine and Australia and Canada now. So there are massive forces here that are also global, but in what key ways do you think Gaza is different in this? Yeah, so there's a global trend, but also in what way is Gaza, and to some extent from your experience of the West Bank, is it different?
Thank you, Carol. So I think the first thing in answering how is Gaza different is really looking at how Gaza used to be before 1948. So before 1948, Qada Gaza used to be 54 Palestinian villages in like 3 to 4 main cities. Now, when the Nakba happened, the space of Qada Gaza used to be 1,111 dunam. Now, the space of Gaza currently is 365 square kilometers. So like, by the act of the Nakba, Gaza has already lost a lot of, natural resources that used to produce a lot of food and to practice agriculture and pastoral activities. So already Gaza had gone through, let's say, industrial re-engineering even before the global trends are taking place. And the global trends are taking place around the world. Gaza is affected by it, but like the momentum or how accelerated the global trends has affected Gaza with the existence of the occupation is something on a much, much larger scale. And if we look at Gaza right now, if you look at the satellite, you have 2 million people crammed in a 365 square kilometers. So in 10 years' time, we might not have any agricultural land left to grow, and some of the adaptation methods that is being adopted by people and encouraged by civil society and aid actor is to use rooftop gardens, but that's a very depoliticized solution, because the solution is not to adopt with whatever little resources we have. Is the solution is that, well, this is not sustainable, and you cannot imagine from a place like Gaza to continue to live when we no longer have land because of that structural re-engineering that happened in the 1948. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is we were not even given a choice to deal with these global trends. So like from the early on, the Palestinian farmers were deprived from their choice because of the colonial practices of the Zionist movement and the British imperialism, and because of the Israeli occupation, that is not only destroyed a lot of the Palestinian lands, but continue to confiscate land. Now, again, in the West Bank is a little bit different. In Gaza, in the West Bank, the confiscation of land is happening on a daily basis with the expansion of the Israeli settlement. In the West Bank, it's more of a slow death of agriculture. So it's the manifestation of how the global trend is happening is through killing agriculture by making the water not suitable for agriculture, by putting so much restriction on the type of fertilizers and pesticides that enter the Gaza Strip and so on, and even by controlling what could be exported from Gaza in terms of crops and meals. So unfortunately, the global trends is affecting the food security, particularly of countries in the global south. And I think with COVID, people were realizing the importance of locally produced and the importance of producing for our own local economies versus producing for luxury crops that could be crossing across borders to different countries. But in a lot of countries that did not manifest into policies that really try to reclaim food sovereignty and land sovereignty, particularly in the global south countries. And it's understandable because the linkages with the global trade makes it very difficult and challenging to do so.
Thank you. Thank you for that full answer. I'm going to invite people who are in the audience to put questions in the Q&A, and we will come to them. I've got some more questions, as you know, but also we do welcome people to contribute to the debate and join the discussion. One of the things that we talked about when we met previously is obviously, climate change, environmental challenges are very much a concern, an urgent concern at the moment. And people are looking again at traditional knowledge for ideas about how we become more sustainable. Do you have ideas around what traditional knowledge practices, how things were grown in the past may help in terms of the climate challenge, both for the practices themselves and for how society operates?
Thank you. So I think really looking at the Palestinian heritage and folklore, there is a lot of knowledge that is being transferred and used to be transferred from one generation to another. Just looking at the Palestinian proverbs on when to plant grapes during February. So, and there is a list of amazing Palestinian proverbs that the Palestinian Natural History Museum has accumulated as a way to disseminate that knowledge to future generation. But even these proverbs, it reflects something that tells us how important it is for us to care for the environment if we wish for the land to give us back. And this is something that is fundamental. So it reflects the value of not being exploitative of the land, of how can we plant something that help our sustainability and survival, but does not kill both of us. And this is something that exists, but also if we look at, the practices of our grandparents, even when they used to go to markets and when there was no plastic bags, and how they used to use a lot of palm trees products in order to do or their grocery shopping and come back in a way that, maintain the environment, and many, many more of these practices. But I think in agriculture, the value that is extremely important for us as Palestinian is the value of collective care that agriculture teach those who practices. With agriculture, it's a hard labor. The success equals the failure, and you need to be patient. You need to work with each other in order to succeed, to have the crops successful. You need to constantly develop yourself. And if we zoom in Gaza, particularly over the past 20 years and the manifestation of the blockade, we have lost one of the very fundamental value in Palestinian society, which is the collective care. The collective care that manifested in the 80s during the first Intifada, and how people were really attempting to sustain their, their activism, sustain the Intifada through that collective care, and we are losing it because we are losing our relationship with the land, because we are, very addicted to the product. We are becoming consumers. So even our care for our local economy is something that is absent because we are told that we are consumers. And to be honest, this is something that the Israeli occupation, it tried to foster many times, particularly in terms of like allowing what kind of products can enter Gaza, what kind of product can be exported to Gaza. So all of the economic sectors that enable Palestinians to be productive of products that they can touch and feel and grow is very limited, while all the products that is of consumer nature are allowed to enter Gaza. There is a lot of dumping for products in Gaza. So like the dumping of carrots in Gaza during the summer period is something that is, to tell Palestinian farmers, it's easier to buy the carrots that is being allowed to enter Gaza than to plant your own carrots. So these are some of the elements in which we are losing by not practicing agricultural practices.
Thank you. Thank you. Carrots, a lot of carrots products coming in. I'm sort of used to also, I'm familiar with ideas of dumping excess food, and again on a global scale, when a certain market goes out, moving the food to come in. I can see, yes, I can see there's some questions coming in the chat. Thank you. We will get to that. So I'm going to ask my next, I've got two more questions, and in some ways we can maybe perhaps link them together. You particularly done work with women. You're interested in gender. How has the role of women in agriculture, how has it differed between generations? You've already spoken about how the whole society is less cohesive and become more consumers than producers. So can you speak a little bit to the role of women? And perhaps I'm going to just roll that in with my final question, which is, can you tell us more about your village and how it has changed and is changing? So something that's very local to you, but also picking up on the role of women.
Thank you, Carol. And I think it's important to give a realistic view on the role of women in agriculture. So 100 years back, it was among the collective, although a lot of women have done so much agricultural labor that is considered unpaid labor, usually invisible labor, when looked at from the family household. So in the past and until now, when we look at agricultural labor, we say the family has helped. Now, who from the family members has helped is something that sometimes is considered insignificant. And that's where a lot of the labor that women do in agriculture become invisible. Now, the difference is that currently there are a lot of attempts by feminist rights organizations and feminist groups to kind of like highlight the role that women has been doing historically and are currently doing it in agriculture. For me, for example, going back to my village, my grandmother and her mother before her used to work in pastoral activities. So they used to take sheep across the historical Palestine for pastoral activity and be away for like months and then coming back. Now, that is a role that women used to play. Now, the restriction on movement that the Israeli occupation has played has limited that kind of role that my grandmother and her mother before her used to do. And it's the same for a lot of Bedouin community, for example, in the West Bank. Now, one element that I want to bring is how in the 1990s, the Israeli issuance of permits for Palestinian workers to work in the historical Palestine as cheap agricultural labor has put so much burdens on Palestinian women in Gaza Strip, not only to cater for their families, but also to do all the agricultural labor in their lands and then and be agricultural laborer. So that was a period of time where there was a lot of intensification of agricultural labor on women. There was double the burden on them because nothing has changed in their unpaid care and domestic work. And this is something not unique only to Gaza. We are seeing it in Southeast Asia, where climate change are pushing, for example, men outside like rural areas to the city, or the economic insecurity are pushing men to the cities, and women are left with all that amount of labor. As I mentioned, one of the differences that exist currently is that there are efforts to work with women in making their work visible. And also there are efforts by, Palestinian civil society, but also like driven by donor to provide more access to opportunities and financial aid for women to advance or increase their participation in agriculture sector. But in general, Carol, agricultural sector in terms of the extent to which it can absorb Palestinian labor force is very limited. It doesn't exceed 6% of the Palestinian workforce.
Yes, yeah, limited opportunities and changing relationships. And can you tell us a little bit more about your village itself, the transformations it has been through? Because, as you say, agriculture is now a small part of the economy. So, and to describe what people are doing in your village and around to make money, to have a life.
So for me, like the village I come from is called Zawaida, and Zawaida and Deir al-Balah are very close. So Deir al-Balah historically is called the monastery of palm trees. So like historically, it used to produce one of the finest like dates that you can ever taste, with like trees aged over 100 years. And in my village, we used to produce a lot of like citrus trees. We used to produce grape, and we used to produce palm trees and olive trees. Now, over the past like 30 years, as I said, the systematic destruction of agriculture and the limitation on exports, in addition to the high water salinity because of the over extraction of water aquifer, has made my village completely unsuitable for the cultivation of many of these crops. So even a tree like palm tree that has a really high tolerance for water salinity is no longer. You can go around Zawaida and you can count the number of palm trees, unfortunately. You can count the number of, the olive trees or the grape trees that used to exist in the past. And this is not only in my village, even in other areas. For example, we have Sheikh Ajlin. In Sheikh Ajlin, some of the grape trees there, it's aged 100 years. So it's older than anything we have known, yet these trees are at risk because of the high water salinity and even the restriction on the fertilizers that can enter. So my village has moved from an agricultural village to a village where there is a lot of like resorts because of demand for internal tourism, resorts because there is no anything else that you can do in Zawaida except to have like a swimming pool for internal resorts, and that is filled sometime with salty water, and that is also destructive on the longer term to the environment in a village like Zawaida. In my village, we've also seen how a lot of the younger generation or the past generation has sold their lands because of the economic insecurity and because of the economic marginalization that they were subjected to. And because they did not practice agriculture as one of the factors, they did not have that very strong relationship with the land where they know that selling a piece of land is like taking, cutting a part of yourself. So like there are many factors contributing to how a very rural agricultural village like Zawaida, where you can see everything green around you when I was a kid and like walking around, to a place that is full with resorts and you can barely count the number of trees that exist.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to, as someone on the outside who's not been able to visit Gaza, to sort of think of how the society operates. And yes, there's a need for resorts, there's a need for other things. And again, this phenomenon of land becoming an asset that you sell for education, marriage, to pay a debt, is a common attitude, but more exaggerated in the context of Gaza. But again, has shown how much things have shifted away from food production. And so, thank you. So with that, I'm going to thank Iman Siam. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, who's left a question. Within such multi-layered challenges, what recommendations do you have to reclaim food and agriculture sovereignty? What practically can be done? Small suggestions, big suggestions. What would you like to see being done?
To be honest, without as long as we depoliticize the issue of agriculture, any suggestion we are giving is going to be painkillers. So like, how can we ensure that Palestinians continue to do the minimum labor in agriculture until there is no land exists? And therefore, the first thing that needs to be done, if we really want to see like fundamental change, is to address the issue of agriculture from a very political lens. Now, the manifestation or the repercussion of addressing agriculture from a very political lens is something that is very tied to the national discourse about Palestine, and even like the solution into how can we basically stop the occupation, and how can we reclaim the Palestinian lands, and how can we, for Palestinians who have been deprived from the land, how can they access their lands? So like any other solutions, and we are all complicit in that, we provide solutions that help Palestinian normalize the status quo, help Palestinian to survive the day until something major and big happen. Now, the answer is that this is not sustainable. And in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, the survival rate is not going to be even possible. And we don't need a UN report like 2020 Gaza is unlivable. We are already seeing it in a way or another, and to be alive is not to be breathing. It's a completely different issue. Now, what can be done? To be honest, in order to go back to the point where Palestinian farmers are, political mobilizers, are social agents, and it could be a very naive suggestion, but we need to learn our history, because our current generation are not aware of how agriculture has been fundamental in our lives as Palestinian, how farmers has been like actors with different roles in different occasions, how Palestinian farmers were fighting against capitalism, which is a fight that we also need to address as Palestinians, how farmers were fighting against the classism, and so many structural systems of oppression that exist. So the first step is to have that kind of knowledge being disseminated, being absorbed by our younger generation, to be part of our Palestinian curriculum, and so on. And the second thing is that we need to also be aware of the Palestinian flora and fauna and learn the history of how we look at the pine tree and we think that this is a Palestinian tree, while it's not. It's a European tree. When we look at the tree that used to fill Salah ad-Din Street, and we think that that's our historical tree, while it's was introduced by an Australian in 1888. So without learning that kind of history, without learning even how our grandparents have lived, we will continue to follow the narrative that Palestinians only need capacity building in order to survive in agriculture. And to me, that doesn't make sense, because I see now everyone is talking about climate change. It's a hot topic. Everyone wants to train younger generation about climate change, and how can you take practices into reducing climate change, while the issue exists in large corporation that does more harm to the environment than the public and the normal people. And we can push people to adopt plastic less, but then how about the practices that our grandparents and grandparents used to do in terms of maintaining the land and the relationship? So these are, it's not giving you magic solution. Unfortunately, I don't have that magic solution, but I think these are, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, are some of the key areas in which we need to work on, and to foster, at least in a place like Gaza. And I think with that knowledge, we will have a generation that hopefully will do the mobilization and the social change. And I'm sorry that it's not a huge answer to your question, Iman.
Yes, she said many thanks, point taken, and she will dive more into your suggestions. So thank you. Any more questions? Please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I mean, I guess what you're saying is it appeals to me is no future without knowledge of the past. So yeah, this is something that's also comes across very much in some of the work I've been doing also in Jordan, or been involved in, that people want to value their past and understand it. And for some people, as you've already said, not everyone, but for some people, to be able to continue this way of life. We have a question from Stephanie Grant, who has joined us late, to ask if there will be a recording. Yes, okay, there will be a recording, and apologies that you joined late. So just saying that, yeah, you had a link for 5 o'clock. So thank you very much. Yes, this will be recorded. Oh, but this is being recorded and it will be uploaded. Any more questions, please, from the floor? Otherwise, I have one last question for Asma, which is, so how are people, how are the younger generation remembering the past? What are they doing now? You were telling me a little bit about weddings and how they were changing, for example.
Yeah, I think from like an agricultural, let's say, heritage, we are seeing, particularly in the diaspora, the attachment to all that is agricultural symbols. So like, you know, having necklaces with the olive trees on it, having the pictures of oranges from Jaffa at the as a wallpaper, having, you know, olive oil being imported from Palestine to the US or to Australia, and like, despite how expensive it is, but it's something from, you know, the land. It's something that is, you know, makes us smell home with it. Having za'atar and many other products is a way in which Palestinian diaspora who might have never visited Palestine or lived there or had that kind of connection, is a way for them to kind of maintain that connection. And this is something very important. But with that comes, I don't want to say like a warning, but rather a cautiousness, because by adopting these symbols, you can be complicit in romanticizing agriculture and not understanding the daily reality of the farmer who needs more from you than wearing a necklace or, like, you know, celebrating the olive harvest. Because on a daily basis, survivor is their strategy into fighting the occupation. So one of the things that is important is, how can you support local Palestinian products? How can you really try and support their produce in a way that is more sustainable for them? So like, not aid, but how can you create markets to the Palestinian local products in a way that creates sustainability towards them? Now, in terms of like how young people are viewing things, it's different. Like, as I said, agriculture is not viewed as something that young people are engaging in unless it becomes sexy and attractive. And by becoming sexy and attractive, the donor community is presenting innovation in agriculture and tech in agriculture and all these new ideas in order for young people to have that kind of connection with agriculture. Now, this might be like, you know, helpful and useful, but with technology, it needs the scale of economies, and this is not possible in a place like Gaza. So if you want to have a smart green house over a $1 of land, it's going to cost you over $15,000 to $20,000, and no farmer in Gaza will do that. So like, it's important to have this conversation. It's good to have these efforts to bring young people in, but without conversation with the older generation of farmers and understanding that it's going to still be very detached solutions in terms of agriculture. Now, you asked something about weddings, and this is part of a conversation that Carol and I were having, and we're saying that in Gaza, looking at identity and how it shifts from a very micro perspective. So like, it's not based on a thorough analysis, but like rather observation, how in Palestinian weddings in Gaza in the 90s, people were more adopting, you know, the dabka, which is considered the Palestinian national folklore and dancing. And then like how right now, like particularly in Bedouin community, they are adapting dances that is more likely reinforce their tribal identity. So the dahiyya has been something that become very, very popular, particularly in Bedouin community, gathering Bedouin communities together and doing like horses races or camel races is something that young people are, enthusiastic about, because it's part of an identity that they can control, because they cannot control, liberation for Palestine or being active participant of their Palestinian identity. So that's one of the observations that we've discussed with Carol.
Yes, thank you. We're drawing to the end of our time, and thank you so much, and also for the questions that are now coming in. So it's just okay. Yeah, there are resources that talk about our history. This is from Mahmoud Nasser in agriculture, and our grandfathers, how they can be how they were a role in change makers in our country. And I can already see there's a conversation going on with some of our other attendees, Siham Rashid talking about 2011 article. There are a lot. There are a lot of resources and increasing resources. People are documenting this, and there are active projects to involve intergenerational conversations around how things were. A number of projects, but I will hand over to Asma again to say, what sort of resources would you direct people to who are interested in finding out about the history of the last 100 years, and particularly the role of farmers and Bedouin in that, and what they did?
Thank you, Carol. So like one of the important resources, to be honest, is the Palestinian Natural History Museum that exists in Beit Lahem. And it's part of the Beit Lahem University, and they have done a lot of research regarding the environmental Nakba and how the Palestinian flora and fauna has been affected. Again, also one of the resources that really look at agriculture and the environment from a colonial lens is the production of Visualizing Palestine. They've done a series last year that looks at the environment in Gaza in a way, and the impact of the Israeli occupation. And thank you, Siham, for sharing the link. Another research that has been like very thorough is exploring the role of Palestinian peasants in the 1936-1939 revolution, that really looked at historically how Palestinians were active in political action. And there are many resources. So I'm not sure, Carol, if we can share some of these resources when we send out the recording for anyone who is interested. You are muted, Carol.
Sorry. If you're willing to also help us, we can add some more resources to the event page and also to the recording for people attending and coming to it later as well. So yes, I was just yeah, there's a lot, and there's more, but there's also more that can be done. And also, to make it an active knowledge, you emphasize the role of storytelling and getting involved is really important. But there are already a lot of resources, and I would second the work of the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability that's at Bethlehem University, and a number of researchers who are working in this area, and also projects that I'm aware of who've been bringing together the different generations to sort of understand change and speak to identity. But also, yes, to say that there's much to recommend the traditional life, but it is a hard way of life as well. So also much to tribute people who sort of founded and carried this knowledge.
Yes.
So, okay, yes, okay. So thank you to those who are putting all their comments of thanks in the chat, and thank you once again to Asma Abu Muzid for her inspiring talk today, and which is very much comes from practical knowledge and experience of her work and also her community. To say to people that we do organize events online, but also at our institutes and in the UK. So if you would like to be added, if you're not already on our mailing list, I believe that we'll put the link in the chat here for you to do that, and sort of watch our website and our social media for future events as well. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you to Asma. Thank you also to Yasmin Al-Khudari, who's behind the CBRL online icon, who's done a lot to arrange this lecture, and also behind the scenes making sure that everything ran smoothly with us today. And we wish you all well wherever you are, and also whether you're in the heat or not at this current time. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.